Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, may I warmly welcome you to the final session of this very interesting conference. This will be the highlight of the conference, I promise, and I'm pretty sure that I'll be right. The topic of today is the strategic outlook of the EU. We'll talk about it, but I would like to start with a Chinese proverb that you might have heard. It says, "May you live in interesting times," and it's supposed to be a curse. We'll see whether it's a curse. We'll definitely live in interesting times. We will definitely talk about the strategic outlook of the EU, about the question if there is any at all, and if it is, what could it be? What can it be? What is it in foreign policy, in defense policy? And we'll definitely also talk about the white elephant in the room, about Syria. Let me address this wonderful panel. We would like to start with Toomas Hendrik, the President of Estonia. He said he doesn't want to. Mr. President, any idea on the strategic outlook of the EU? Or should I ask the Foreign Minister first?
I'll answer that, actually, since I would say that what distinguishes the European Union and NATO both from other similar organizations is that they, sort of as part of the key institutions of the liberal democratic world, is following the same rule. You're following your own rules. That if you have agreed to do something, such as strive for 2% of defense spending, if you agree that in order to join the euro you have to have a deficit no larger than 3%, or indebtedness greater than 60%, then you ought to follow those rules. Because otherwise you get into the tragedy of the commons. Some people follow the rules, others don't follow the rules, and pretty soon you're in very serious trouble, as we have seen when it comes to the European economies. And I don't think it is sustainable, either in the European Union financially, to continue without, by not following the rules or selective following of the rules. And given the situation where, the United States comprises about roughly 1/3 of the population of NATO, yet it provides, it pays for 70% of the expenditure of NATO. Because the population, if you take, including Turkey, is basically 900 million. The U.S. is basically 300 million. Okay, give or take a Canada or something. That's 30 million. But basically, that's what the price is. And I cannot see this continuing with the low level of defense spending. Very few countries in Europe reach the 2% that we've all basically agreed to do. So when you ask me where are we going, well, the problem, I think, is that we have there's no stick. We have carrots. You want to join, but I remember when we joined NATO, Ron Asmus said to me, the late great Ron Asmus, that our biggest fear is that once you're in, you won't pay anymore, and all these lines about wanting to be a security provider as opposed to a security consumer is all sort of nice PR for getting in. So I think what we need to do is impose some rules. And clearly, no one's going to throw anyone out of the European Union. That's just not going to happen. No one's going to get thrown out of NATO for not paying the dues. But I do have a slightly softer version of that, which is that next year we're up for a number of positions. A number of positions are opening up in both the European Union and NATO. And these are highly prestigious places. It's President of the European Union, President of the Commission, the High Commissioner for whatever. Well, it depends how much it's done. I think that's why I say whatever. And of course, SecGen of NATO. And so I propose the 25% rule.
Meaning what?
I'll explain. That since we have agreed in in NATO, that we all strive for 2%, that you have no moral authority as SecGen if your country contributes less than your defense expenditures are less than what is 25% less than agreed upon, so that basically the limit that you have to at least pay 1.5% of your GDP for defense. I mean, if you pay 0.7 or 0.9, you have no claim. 1.4, which I think the Federal Republic pays, I mean, no claim. So too with President of Europe and so forth. I mean, there we apply the Maastricht criteria. I mean, it's accepting that you in no case have a real chance of any of those positions unless you're in the euro. But, 3%, okay, no deficit larger than 4%, 60% indebtedness, no claim to any position with indebtedness greater than 80%.
You're convinced you're going to get the qualified majority for that one?
Well, are there any candidates left?
Well, Estonia could fill all 5.
What about Sweden?
But no, my point is that we need some kind of sticks. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, how seriously can you take a SecGen coming from a country that is far from 2%, saying we need to raise defense expenditure? It just doesn't work, especially if you're a former prime minister from a country that made the budget decisions not to spend. And so too with the position. So I would say that what we lack is any kind of motivation. Everyone wants a prestigious position. I'll tell you now, I'm not in the running. I like it where I am. But I think that we need some kind of, we need to get people to deal with these issues. Otherwise, we're going to have the tragedy of the commons, which is not a good idea in security, and it's really a bad idea, as we've already seen when it comes to fiscal behavior within the European Union.
Do we also need more talk about a common strategy? Do we have any such? Will we ever have any?
Well, I find it hard to believe in having a common strategy if the things we've already agreed upon are not followed. I mean, what do we have? A common foreign policy taken by countries that don't follow common fiscal policy? Not too likely.
Sounds pretty desperate.
I don't think it's desperate. I mean, I think it's hardcore realist.
Bildt, would you agree to that one?
To the different criteria. Well, I don't know the exact figures at the moment, but go back not too many years. I think the highest defense expenditure in NATO was probably Greece. It doesn't really, it shows that the criteria might not be a perfect one in terms of deciding which country is the biggest contributor to the security of Europe. So one has to look at this somewhat more nuanced. I agree with you, it's important. But I mean, we are also in the process of, we spend whatever we spend. I think we spend roughly 190 billion euros on defense in the European Union.
You're not in NATO, so it doesn't matter.
No, but I mean the European Union. You've heard of that. So I'm concerned with quite a lot how we spend the amount of money. If we just were to take that particular figure and add 2030 without doing structural reforms, it might be useless. But I think there might be ways of spending this money far better than we do. A number of countries are going through the enormous transformation of their defense structures from the sort of the mass armies, conscript armies that we needed in the past, to somewhat more different structures. That's a transition that the UK did a long time ago, France did 10 years ago, the Germans are sort of beginning to be in, and we will end up with something that in terms of defense structures, call it NATO, call it EU, is going to be far more sensible, I hope, in a couple of years' time.
I disagree, actually, because the amount of money you spend on with a conscript army, basically about 25 to 30% of your defense budget goes towards salaries. In a professional army, it's about 70, 80. Yes, I look at the numbers, I compared it. And small countries have a special problem because you don't have any reserve. you don't have a serious reserve. So if you have a small professional army, you no longer have a reserve because you no longer have a conscription army, and then you're really in deep trouble.
But the point is, anyhow, we can dispute the figures. We are in the middle of a defense transformation process all through Europe. Some are somewhat more advanced, some are somewhat less advanced. We must concentrate on that. NATO is doing it, the EU is doing it. But then if you look at the strategic concept, we had a discussion, we had all of the EU foreign ministers discussing this over lunchtime yesterday, and I quoted the first sentence of the strategic security strategy of the European Union that we adopted in 2003. And it says, Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, so free. That sounded all right in 2003, but it doesn't ring entirely correct now. We've gone through a profound economic crisis. Our place among the economies of the world is in question. We are doing fundamental reforms of the way in which we coordinate our economic strategies and look at competitiveness. We are evidently in a situation where the strategic environment is far more volatile than it used to be. If we look towards our east, we got the Eastern Partnership issues. We got 140 million in Russia, wherever they are heading. We have 100 million people in southeastern Europe, 100 years after 1914, where we haven't assured the stability as of yet. And we have in the order of 400 million people in the Arab world, which is nearby. It's very nearby. That is likely to head into a fairly prolonged period of turmoil and strife. And beyond that, the Sahel, beyond that, Central Asia, beyond that, Afghanistan. These are issues that require that we develop coordinated security structures of a fairly comprehensive nature to deal with, be that instability in Mali, or be that whatever is going to happen in the Levant in the years to come, assuring that Afghanistan doesn't collapse. Add to that the cyber domain, which Toomas normally speaks quite a lot about, where we need to be present and we need to secure the flows that are increasingly important for the well-being and security of our societies. The space domain is becoming increasingly important. We are becoming more, the Galileo system is starting to get up and running. We are building a space awareness system. All of these issues need to be taken together. And all of the missions that we have from the EU side, now I'm EU, Toomas, Mr. President.
Anyway.
No, we have roughly 7,000 persons deployed on CSDP missions around the world. Some of them are doing good work, some of them somewhat less so. But we will probably need to have far more people being able to do those stability missions, be that Georgia, be that Mali, be that what we do in Somalia, or be that something else, in order to be able to handle a security environment where challenges are going to be far more diverse than they used to be, and far more difficult and far more comprehensive. And that, I think, is the task, to develop these structures that are integrated, EU, NATO, national, in a way we don't have it at the moment.
At this point, I would like to bring in Mr. Sikorski, Minister Sikorski, but a short remark from the President.
I mean, I raise that thing just simply because I don't see anything happening either in NATO or the European Union if we do not do what we've agreed to do, and therefore coming up with a strategy, a vision of the future, unless we fulfill the common axiom of we do what we agreed to do. We don't go there just to say, okay, we're going to do this, never intending to do so, as some countries did, and especially when it comes to the euro. There was no intention of some countries ever to fulfill those criteria in reality. And so, I mean, when I see this thing, well, what do you do with the numbers? That's not, I mean, the point, I'm looking at the fundamentals of the European Union. Do we follow? I mean, is there any point in agreeing, or do we simply lie and say we'll all do this like a Communist Party convention?
Mr. Sikorski, do you agree to that one? I remember that when 2003, Solana at that time wrote this security strategy, we were all pretty proud because we said this is an aspiration We want to get there. Now this sounds like vice versa. We write down lots of things, but we don't comply with them. Would you agree that we need a new strategy and that this would help us to better?
We are very good at producing strategic documents. It's strategic action that we are bad at. I think President Ilves has put his finger right on it when he said that what's at stake is our credibility. That there should be incentives for countries to come up to their undertakings. My favorite fantasy is that the time that defense ministers and others, ourselves, are allowed to speak at NATO or EU meetings should be in proportion to the per capita resources that we devote to operations. Maybe that would put the fear of God in some of our decision makers. But speaking seriously, in the EU we have the opportunity to learn from those mistakes at NATO. For example, if Italy were to launch what is envisaged under the Lisbon Treaty, which is to say the permanent structured cooperation in defense, Italy could propose during its presidency the entry criteria into the permanent structured cooperation. And those could be things like level of spending, but also other things that make it impossible for us to be effective, like the fact that you should give the commanders the troops to really to be commanded, rather than to be commanded from a national parliament 5,000 kilometers away. Also, joint rules of engagement, so that the commander in the theater doesn't have to think 30 times before he sends this or that contingent into action. These are lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan and some other places.
But did we all learn them, or did just you learn them, or the three of you learned them?
Well, I mean, there are some benefits from being in this job for a while. But coming back to Europe's strategy, I believe that the European Union should play to its strengths. And our strengths are the biggest market on earth, our civilizational attractiveness, and the fact that our neighbors don't fear us, but rather want to associate themselves with us. And if we overcome the crisis and rebuild our soft power, those are remarkable advantages. And then we should also overcome the fragmentation that obtains not only in the defense area, to which Carl already alluded, but also in our diplomacy. Because economies of scale also work in diplomacy. I've done a rough calculation of how many diplomatic posts EU member states and the EU have. And depending how you count, whether you include trade promotion offices, but if you include embassies, trade promotion offices, and consulates, EU member states together have, I believe, more than 5,000 posts. Mm-hmm. Now compare that with the United States, and you get the kind of punch in each one of those countries that we could be taking advantage of. And of course, national diplomatic services will not disappear, but some functions we could be doing together. We could co-locate more. We could issue Schengen visas in Schengen houses in more places, and so on. We should be, in Kabul, for example, I have, I think, 5 diplomats and 16 security personnel. I'm sure it's the case for others too. We could save ourselves a lot of money and become much more influential if we learned to do things together more than today.
But we do actually learn? When I listen to you, I hear about numbers, I hear about ideas, I hear about strategy. Do I hear something about reality? Do we really get our act together, better together today than we did 10 years ago, so that those numbers really matter?
Rome wasn't built in a day. But a part of these things that Radek is talking about, we are starting to do. We started to do them sort of just a couple of years ago. We have, I have roughly the same numbers as Radek. We have between 50 and 60,000 EU diplomats around the world. And I sometimes say that if we can just take the man-hours that EU diplomats spend attending each other's National Day receptions, it would be roughly equal to State Department diplomatic personnel around the world. I mean, there are huge advantages that we can gain by operating together in different ways. Then, of course, it's of course a question of having the policies there, not only the institutions, the policy, not only, as I say, the hardware of institutions that we deal with in Brussels quite a lot, but also the software of policies to make these institutions work. And to develop the foreign security policy, have the different missions. I've mentioned the 7,000 that we have out in the world in the different smaller or bigger missions. The biggest one is Kosovo, I think. There will be more of that and more coordinated. We started to build this with the Lisbon Treaty. We are now in the process of reviewing the entire external action thing. We spent some time, as I said yesterday, discussing preparation for our prime ministers and presidents to discuss the defense issues in December, see what comes out of that. And we have, as Toomas, or President, alluded to, we have all of the crazy circus of 2014 coming up when it comes to reviewing the institutions, looking at the policies, having an election to the European Parliament, and then taking decisions on new personalities. So it is work in progress. All of us think it's too slow, but it's not non-existent.
Let me explain one thing, which I think leads to a different problem, but I would say one of the reasons why countries like Poland and Estonia actually look at numbers is that our accession process was a constant review of numbers. You're not there yet. We're not going to close that chapter yet. You're not there yet. Now, and then you get in, and then you find out that no one's looking at any numbers.
So you would say now it's payback time.
No, it's not payback time. We just believe in a different kind of Europe, that rules are to be followed. And in fact, when you discover that, and no one else has had this before. I mean, we were the first enlargement where people seriously looked at because it was not exactly a popular thing, and in fact, it was the first enlargement. The 2004 enlargement was the first time actually was a performance-based. It was not like, well, let's bring them in and they'll get better, which was the argument in all previous enlargements with the kind of results that we got, especially when it was also the attitude towards the euro, which is that, well, bring them in and they'll learn how to do it, or we'll bring them in and everything will be fine. And then with us, they really looked at the numbers. And now, so payback time is not the word, but certainly I think that the persistence of an attitude towards the East is another fundamental problem. And it crops up in the attitudes that you see with successful Eastern countries that want so-called. We are, for the first time, 10 years after the neutral enlargement of 1995, no one talked about new members. It's been 10 years since we joined the European Union. We still hear about the new members. Get over it. No, when they talk about new members, they talk about Poland, they talk about Estonia, they talk about Latvia. Bizarre. But in 2005, I didn't hear anyone say, well, Sweden, the new member, no, it was not there. And so you have so-called new members still being new members, meeting their obligations, and then, I'm beginning to feel that actually Donald Rumsfeld had something there with the new.
We leave that aside, I think, for the moment. Don't you
I'm saying it's a category that we may actually have to come back to, given that this divide is persisting, especially when it comes to CAP, where it was agreed that we still all get less, and it's agreed to that no change will take place until 2028, which is a quarter of a century after the enlargement. So I think we have to bring this into the debate as well, as I'm sure that.
I think before we go too much into this inter-European struggle, I'll get the American in. When you listen to that, does this sound very European to you?
When I was asked to be on this panel Wednesday, I might point out that I made one decision, which is I did not want to play the role of the American bashing the feckless Europeans. First of all, because I don't believe that Europeans are feckless, but second, because I didn't think that would be my contribution. So I'm going to take your question and redirect it, which is to say, I think what I wanted to contribute is the thought that it doesn't make any sense to talk about a strategic perspective or a strategic outlook or a strategy without talking about the objective. It doesn't make sense to talk about strategies without objectives. You can get up in the morning and open the door and head out on the path, but unless you know where you're going, you don't know if you've got there, you've just gone for a walk. So I thought what I would do is spend the last 2 days listening to the conversations, which I have, and really learned a lot from them and enjoyed them, and try and pull out what I think some of the objectives my European hosts and colleagues and friends have been talking about, and then kind of frame it that way. So that's what I'm going to offer. And the way I'm going to frame it is, in my life when I'm not going to conferences or teaching or things like that, I'm a mom, and I have one son successfully out of college, another in college, and a daughter going. And there's this big conversation all the time in the United States among people who have teenagers. It's called the college derby. You know, how does your kid get into the college, the ambitious college they want to get into? And the advice you get from college professionals is that your children, your teenagers, should have 3 categories of schools they're looking at. The stretch school, which is the one where, oh my God, your life is perfect, it's great, everyone bows down at you if you get in there. Then there's the target school. That is a really good school where you'll be really happy, and you can work hard, and you can probably get into that one, but you're going to really have to focus on it. And then there's the third set of schools. They're called the safety schools. That's if everything else goes badly, at least you'll go to college school. And so then I started thinking and the reason for doing that is you don't want to just apply to colleges you know you'll get into, because that's not ambitious, but you don't only want to apply to the stretch schools, because then that can risk disaster. You have to manage your strategy in light of your objectives, but also your resources and reality. So what would be, and I'm perfectly happy to be corrected by my esteemed panel colleagues or the audience, but it seemed to me I could propose three kind of goals for the strategic perspective for Europe. And I'm going to go in reverse order. The safety objective, your safety school, it seems to me, is integration and internal coherence. And the challenge for Europe right now is you've been working on just achieving your safety school. You've been, and because of the economic crisis, because I'm sure of many other reasons that we've already heard raised, there's a sense that right now Europe's playing defense. You're just trying to make sure that you're still in the game. But that's okay. You have to have the safety objectives as well. From the conversations I've heard the last 2 days, I would propose that one target objective, one way of framing Europe's target objective, could be active and successful global partnerships with the United States in responding to crises, in problem solving. I'm not just talking about defense, I'm talking about development, human security, a whole range of issues. That global partnership, that is having an impact beyond Europe, helping to solve global challenges, could be what we might think of as a target objective. And then, but I also heard what I would categorize as Europe's stretch school, your stretch college, which would actually be European global leadership on its own terms. That is, a Europe that can shape and not just respond to crises and demands, not just join the American president at a joint conference to talk about common goals, but actually be able to shape the environment, to prevent problems before they arise, and to put a European value and a European stamp on that, because sometimes there is a real European value and European stamp that is consistent with, I would like to think, American goals and objectives ourselves, but still has a role to play on its own. And so then I'm just going to leave you with the thought of what this would look like on Syria. And again, I'm happy to adjust, be told I'm wrong, but I was thinking about how would I apply this. And we've seen the safety objective really what the effects of not having achieved that objective fully on Europe's response to Syria. And we could talk about the American response. I'm not impugning Europe and noting American perfection on this. But I heard in the last couple of days a great deal of frustration that all the inability to secure the safety goals about a Europe that's integrated fully, that is functional, that is coping well with all the financial crises and economic crises has really created problems for being able to just do very much at all as the crisis emerged. The target objective, global partnership with the United States, would be not necessarily, and not at all necessarily, require agreeing with the United States on the use of military force or anything like that, but having a constructive partnership with the United States, not this week, but 6 months ago, on what was necessary to cope with what was clearly going to be a major challenge in Syria. And if it wasn't the chemical weapons use, it was going to be something else. And that target goal hasn't been reached either, but it implies a different set of activities.
Did the US know 6 months ago?
Well, we can talk about that too. Some of us did. And then there's the stretch objectives, which I also heard, which is the sense that Europe hasn't been able to leverage the kind of experience it's had, for example, so successfully in Southeast Europe, in some of the partnership countries, to to address early on the clear developments in the Arab world, the youth bulge, the sectarian differences, the issues of development and democratization and civil society that the EU really focuses on closer to its borders. But I would recognize that that's a stretch goal, because that's a real strategy, because that requires really looking further out. So I'm not in the end going to tell you if I think Europe's doing a good job on the strategy, because I'm still struggling a little bit about which are the reasonable objectives for Europe right now, and then we can work together to think about how to make the strategy work.
Mr. Bildt, at one point I saw you nodding, and at another point I saw you shaking the head. Do you agree with the criteria in general and specific? You think the assessment is right?
Well, of course, essentially, I think so. Yeah. I mean, the safety and security is, of course, sort of there, the primary. I would phrase that increasingly less primarily in territorial terms, more securing the flows, the digital flows, the trade flows. We are U.S. is also digitally exposed to the world. But we are bigger than the US and East Asia as a trading power together. We are enormously dependent upon the flows across the oceans, enormously dependent on the flows in cyberspace. We must secure those. Then I agree with you, shape the neighborhood by the different means. Radek talked about our soft powers and attractiveness. This is the Balkans, this is the Eastern Partnership, this is increasingly the South. Are there any easy solutions? Can we measure success or failure in terms of days and weeks? No, probably in terms of decades, because it is very long-term transformation of societies that we are involved in. And then I would go beyond that, stabilize the neighborhood of the neighborhood. And then we are down in Sahel and we are further in Central Asia, because if those places blow up the one way or the other, or disintegrate, then our near neighborhood will be exposed. And if our near neighborhood doesn't work, then our security is impaired. Add to that the entire flow thing, which is cyberspace and outer space. It's a fairly demanding agenda, which requires both a strategic outlook, instruments, policies, and resources. And it's a different agenda from the ones that we faced only a couple of years ago. More volatile, more insecure, more demanding, I would argue, in every single of these respects.
Mr. President?
It's a minor comment. Basically, I mean, there used to be a series in New York called Block That Metaphor. At the risk of getting that title, I would say, basically, yes, I agree. I went to Columbia, I went to Oxford, all very nice, but in fact, Europe is a community college that is going bankrupt. And so you're there, and you have limited objectives, but even that is not working. Now, more broadly, I think that maybe we're expecting too much. I mean, let's face it, it took from 1776 to the New Deal for there to be a federal government. I mean, the U.S. had 25,000 soldiers before World War II on active duty. I mean, there was the interstate commerce regulation. There was a State Department, but otherwise it was all at the level of states, aside from the Civil War with the Emergency Powers Act or whatever Lincoln had. But the point is that, that was 150 years before the federal government actually became a serious player. Before that, it was all at the level of states. In fact, it took almost 50 years to get to a common currency with a central bank. So, maybe, I don't know when Hamilton, he had his proposal. But anyway, the point is that it took a while to get there, and we're talking about the 1820s when you began to have consolidation, 50 years after the U.S., became independent. Well, say we take the the Treaty of Rome as the beginning, it's 50 years. We have to give that time. That's why I think there is this disconnect between the United States, a temporal disconnect between what the United States has done over 230 years and what Europe has done in 50. So the expectation should be lower. In fact, I'm sometimes surprised at the vehemence of anti-European opinion among U.S. academics, saying, these people are all silly and stupid and they don't know what they're doing and the whole thing is ridiculous. Well, that's true, but I don't know. I haven't really looked at what UK, England and France said about the United States in the 1820s, but we're in the 1820s as far as the integration process goes. So I agree with the criticism, but first of all, we have to fix the community college so that it doesn't go bankrupt and we'll be just without an education. And secondly, we need more time to get to that level of integration that the United States has, and that applies also to all the thousands and thousands of diplomats we have on national days.
Mr. Sikorski, what's your take? And would you dare to mention the words Syria in connecting it with the criteria?
Sure, we can discuss Syria, but let me make 2 points first. I agree again with President Ilves when he says that there is still prejudice in some quarters against the poorer cousins from the East. And how unjustified it is best seen here in Riga, in Latvia. But the idea that West Europeans can learn something useful from us in the post-communist part of Europe is still revolutionary. But I'll put it to you that if the rest of Europe handled the economic crisis as well as Latvia did, with the courage, with the determination, and with the political skill of the Prime Minister who did it and then won the election, all of Europe would be much better off and the crisis would now be over a long time ago. And secondly, you mentioned Syria, but there is more trouble in the south. I think when we were launching Eastern Partnership, Carl, there were many skeptical voices. But after not even 5 years, all right, we are having a very interesting game right now over who will initial or sign what at Vilnius in November. Some countries are doubling their efforts, others are being persuaded, shall we say, to drop their efforts. But the point is we have a realistic chance of either signing or initialing deep and comprehensive free trade areas with 3 countries, with Ukraine, with Moldova, and with Georgia, whose Prime Minister is with us and has just confirmed that his country is firmly determined. Now, let me just finish the sentence. There is nothing like that happening in the south. In other words, all the possible successes of the EU neighborhood and foreign policy are in the east.
I was going to add that there's a 4th country, the US, that we need a DCFT with.
Sure.
Nevertheless, if we learned the lesson from the east, what then should we do in the south? Do we act in the right way concerning Syria? I have to ask again.
I was the first EU foreign minister in Benghazi when Gaddafi was still alive and fighting. And I talked to the members of the Provisional Council. And I realized then that they were facing almost an identical set of challenges that we were facing when communism collapsed. In other words, one way of looking at what is happening in the Arab world is that that is also the collapse of the Cold War order, because some of these secular dictatorships held themselves in power by aligning with one side or the other in the Cold War. And so they will be facing a similar challenge. And I think that we have much more to teach them, and we are much more credible in doing so than some of the older and richer democracies. So that's why we've deployed our Wunderwaffe, Lech Wałęsa, in Tunisia, for example. And we could teach the Egyptians a thing or two about making peace and between a military regime and civil society or religiously inspired people, and so on. So I think I don't know where they are, whether they are in 1848 or 1989. And I think the aspect, by the way, that we've neglected is that to a large extent, the trouble in the Arab world is the trouble of frustrated entrepreneurship in very corrupt, very bureaucracy-laden countries. And here we again could play a positive role. Last sentence. We are only now equipping ourselves in Europe to be able to help them. And I mean that we've just created the European Endowment for Democracy, which has just opened up to consider programs to give assistance to.
I find it interesting that I ask Syria and you answer with European soft power. Rebuilding the Arab world, learning how to rebuild broken down countries from the East. Did I ask the wrong question, or sorry.
I'll answer for Radek. I mean, basically, we're the wrong countries to ask, having been without caveats per capita among the highest troop concentration in Afghanistan. You should perhaps ask some of the countries, one which you know well, which had caveats. And so when it comes to countries that have actually been in the worst parts of Afghanistan, suffered per capita major losses, we have a different reason to be a little reticent, though we are nonetheless, at least Estonia, I haven't followed the Polish statement, but we are strongly with the United States on Syria. And so, but on the other hand, we're not the countries to ask about, okay, would you put boots on the ground? Well, we have. And maybe some other countries can also go ahead and deal with these
Maybe
things.
one of the ministers who just came from Vilnius could very briefly tell us how big the unity was at this conference.
I mean, depends on what you mean when you talk about Syria. Let's be realistic. We have an escalating civil war in the entire Levant, with X numbers of different factors. Shia, Sunni, quite a number of other factors. It's a multitude. It's a clash within the civilization, playing out from Beirut to Basra. How do we deal with that? Are there any simple solutions? I mean, the only thing that I could say would give me reasonable chance of success would be to go in with armies and stay there for 30 years and try to do some true nation building. Appetite for that, non-existent. We have been trying to sort out Iraq and Afghanistan, to other pieces less complicated, I would argue, than Syria. Patience among our publics, somewhat limited. I mean, the American message, and I was somewhat critical of President Obama when he said, we are ending end of nation building abroad, now we've got to do nation building at home. The only thing that we can do is some very, very, very limited things. That's not going to work. We need to have a far more comprehensive, long-term political approach to this entire region, understanding that there are no simple solutions. It's difficult. The Algerian civil war went on for 10 years. The Lebanon one went on for 15 years. And at that particular time, both the Americans and the French and the UN had boots on the ground, very short, because they were taken out fairly soon. And then at the end, we've managed to sort out Lebanon, so. And now it is an immensely complex problem. There's not a simple solution. We will have, from the European side, to stay engaged with this part of the world for decades to come in every single respect, because it is our immediate neighborhood, irrespectively of the issue of chemical weapons today, because the day after, things are not going to look substantially different from what they do today.
I would also say one other thing. Asking about Syria is asking someone to do multivariate differential calculus. We cannot master the multiplication tables when we see the threats. I mean, 3 days ago, Dmitry Rogozin says, we hope you don't have a cold winter in Moldova because they are thinking of signing the association agreement. Now, if the EU, with its explicit policy of the Eastern Partnership, cannot roundly, solidly, sort of say this is unacceptable. I mean, the Swedes, Carl Bildt, I tweeted you this morning, said it is unacceptable. Where's the EU statement saying no way, and we're not going to let someone who wants to get closer to us to be punished with a cold winter simply because they share our values? This is unacceptable. I think that the EU is not making a strong statement on this, and I was personally rather disappointed in that. I mean, the facts were on the ground already before. I mean, the Ukrainian embargo, whatever you want to call it, the threats against Moldova made by the Russian Minister for Defense Procurement, or whatever he is. I mean, these are heavy statements, and nothing.
Would you like to add something at this point? Mr. Sikorski?
Look, Armenia has made its choice. It wasn't exactly a free choice, but it's a choice, and we are respecting it. We expect the same attitude by our Russian partners towards other countries, making their choice to take the difficult path of modernization.
At this point, tradition of this conference is to allow questions and to allow you to ask whatever you wanted to ask. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand quickly. I think there will be plenty of them. We actually answered everything? I don't believe that.
Answered virtually nothing.
Over there. I can go on.
It's me again, Artur Slenj from the Latvian Parliament. What happened in St. Petersburg? We heard that some countries agreed to sign the declaration on Syria, some countries didn't. Actually, there is no German sitting on the panel, because I heard that Germany did not side with Great Britain, America, and Turkey, and so on. Please comment this. But I think that if we're talking about European strategy, we're ignoring completely that Germany is not fulfilling its role. And now I remember what the Foreign Minister Sikorski said in Berlin 2 years ago. And it's coming back to that. They are shying away from Germany's responsibility. And we talked about this yesterday, that no German troops are taking part in steadfast jazz, but there are 1,000 French troops. How do you explain this?
But she's not on the panel.
That's true.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. I don't know whether I'm absolutely right, but the last news agency reports from Vilnius said that Germany might sign now, that it was looking for a more European answer, but you might know it much better than I do.
No, I mean, we briefed on the more acute aspect of Syria. We've spent, I think we spent nearly 4 hours, the 28 foreign ministers of the European Union, with John Kerry. I think that hasn't happened for a very long time. Give and take, really And Syria now is just not a question of one thing or the other, black and white. It is a very complicated problem. And one of the challenges that we face going to the G20, there were two statements, whether it was 10 or 11 on the one side or whatever. But the word is split. I mean, there were some on one statement which didn't go that far, by the way, even that statement. And the others on another line. That's not good. Because whatever happens, we need the global support and the global legitimacy to some extent for perhaps difficult decisions that are going to be taken. And we spent quite some time on this, all of us, sort of Atlantic foreign ministers, let us call it that, in Vilnius. And I think Cathy Ashton presented something after that which sort of shows elements of a way ahead, and I think there will be further development in the next few days that sort of brings it in a better direction. But this is diplomacy in action in a situation that is profoundly difficult, where the easy answers, if they were there, we would have found them, but they are not there.
I have a question.
With one corner of my eye, I'm following the Twitter feed, and there is among the audience clearly a mood of regret, even some comments on this being the post-interventionist era on display. Well, let me challenge that directly. I mean, do you really want us to do another Iraq? Was that really such a good idea? Was it worth the treasure and the blood that we expended there? And don't you think it's better that we, this time, examine the evidence, try all the diplomatic avenues, and think about the consequences first before we plunge in?
It's also post-interventionist for everyone. I mean, the United States is not going in to Syria either. I mean, this is basically, it is a post-interventionist era for at least everyone in the Euro-Atlantic space. We'll see if some of our friends to the east of the Eastern Partnership are as post-interventionist as we.
I'll just very quickly note one thing, because this is supposed to be a discussion on Europe and European global strategy. We're confusing three issues on Syria. One is the use of chemical weapons by the regime against anyone, but certainly against civilians, and responding to that. Then there's what to do, which was in part the huge mess, which is it's already a disaster. It's already a civil war, so you can't prevent the civil war. So what do you do about the civil war and its regional implications? And then there's the question of how do you prevent this from happening more and more and more in the Middle East and, frankly, other places in Eurasia where the same underlying factors are there. And you can do all three. And you have to do all three. There's the immediate response to, and I'm not arguing everyone has to agree on the use of military force, but we do have to respond to the use of chemical weapons by a government against its own people. And we're going to have to come up with some kind of response to the disaster that is the Syrian civil war. And we've got to figure out how to prevent this from happening, or we're going to face decades of this across a huge space from North Africa to Afghanistan.
Mr. Bildt?
Well, this phrase, post-interventionist, I would classify myself as a cautious but determined interventionist. When you do it, do it. I am concerned with the lack of strategic patience in the West when it comes to intervention. I'm concerned with the short attention span, the belief that you could go in and that's it, and you leave and happiness is there. Radek mentioned he was in Benghazi. I haven't been to Benghazi. I can't go to Benghazi. No one can go to Benghazi. It is off limits to Westerners these days. We are in the middle of everything when we listen to our colleagues from Italy and Malta and their profound concerns about what's happening in Libya, because we haven't followed up. We think we solved it. We didn't. It's a major issue that is evolving there. What do we do with Egypt? We are about to leave Afghanistan. I hope we are right in what we are doing. Iraq have 1,000 deaths last month. If you do, and we are still in Kosovo. I wouldn't say that is a major crisis, but we are still there with forces 15 years after. We are struggling with Bosnia. after more... I mean, I'm not against going in, certainly not. But I'm worried by the lack of strategic patience in the West when we do something and the short attention span. These things take their time. And when we do something, and we Europeans will have to do more in this volatile environment, North Africa, Sahel, the Levant, Southeastern Europe, we must be prepared to commit resources long-term, face the complexities of history with greater determination than the attention span given by the evening news normally allows. Otherwise, we'll fail and might, as a matter of fact, create more problems than we solve.
Let me just add also, I think that if you actually look at the initial hypothesis of Fukuyama, we've ended this age of ideology. Now it's just, sort of this neo-Hegelian view. I mean, actually, with empirical hindsight, which, this is a testable hypothesis, then actually the bulk of the countries, first of all, the ones that came out of the Soviet Union, the ones that came out of the former Yugoslavia, you add to that now democratic revolutions across the Arab world, they've been failures. The successes are actually a minority. They're a minority that we talk a lot about because we're from there. But if you look at the entire sort of spectrum of responses of overthrowing authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, then the success rate is fairly low. I mean, Latvia is a super example of a success. But, look at the 15 post-Soviet republics. We all hate that term, of course, in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But, 3 out of 15 is, a passing grade is 60, 65, 70, we're 20.
Thanks. I think we're going to collect a few more questions over there with the gentleman in the third row.
Thanks. Tom Wright at Brookings. And with all due respect to Minister Sikorski, I don't think anyone's suggesting another Iraq in Syria. There are many issues that arise out of the current crisis, including how to ensure that military action is legitimate given the paralysis in the Security Council, whether or not the norm against chemical weapons is worth upholding, how that will be done, the future relationship with Russia. What's sort of surprising to me anyway in the audience is the extent to which many of the panelists so far have done verbal somersaults to not engage with these questions and instead have focused on the process and budgetary and bureaucratic issues. So I think that's perhaps maybe where some of the tweets are coming from. But again, to sort of press you on, what do you think the implications of this crisis are? What are the main lessons? And does the United States have the right or the legitimacy to act unilaterally if necessary? And would that be effective?
I think we're going to take one more over there, and then over here, and then we go back to the pretty difficult question.
Well,
Just wait for a second. I think there in the back was the man on the second row. Could you please give him the microphone? Or you just wait for the microphone because we have people watching on the internet. It should be coming.
Isn't there someone with a microphone?
Nope. Okay.
Thank you very much. Julian Lindley-French. We've heard much talk of the international community over the last week. Is this not, tragedy though it is, in the Syrian crisis, also a crisis of global governance? We're seeing on one side Russia and China, which are saying sovereignty at any cost. On our side, we're saying humanitarianism at any cost. If indeed this is the new fault line in global governance, what are the implications for the functioning of the institutions in which we invest so much political and strategic capital?
As we could spend another hour on those two questions, I take a third one, the gentleman who had the microphone before, and then we go back to the panelists.
Hans Kundanani from ECFR. A similar question, actually, to the two previous ones. I mean, obviously, Syria is a problem from hell, and it's a difficult judgment call. I'm also agnostic about what to do. But what I would love to hear your views on is to go back to the broader question of what European strategy should look like, not just on the narrower question of military interventions, but more broadly. In particular, what consequences should we draw from this for our relationships with China and Russia, countries who we claim to have strategic partnerships with?
All right, who wants to go first?
Well, I'd like to answer the gentleman from Brookings. I was at the American Enterprise Institute in the run-up to the Iraq War, where the Iraq War was invented. And I can tell you, Iraq wasn't meant to be Iraq either. My colleagues were expecting the ancient Mesopotamian bureaucracy to manage Iraq, but this time democratically. US troops were meant to be welcomed as liberators, and initially they were, as you know, and look at where we are now. And that war plus Afghanistan, it's calculated, cost the US $3 trillion. I mean, even you can't afford these kinds of engagements. And at the same time, it'll be increasingly impossible not to do something. Not even because of the use of chemical weapons. And by the way, I think we reached consensus today on pretty much everybody is convinced that they were used and that they were used by the regime. And something will come out of that. But this is the largest refugee crisis since the exodus from Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion in 1979. We have 2 million external refugees, 5 million internally displaced persons, and this is going to blow the budgets of the donor countries and international institutions and neighboring states. And so, and it's going to get worse. So I think the pressure to do something will increase. But I think we need more time to consider the implications, because we are getting ourselves into a situation in which to do something will be morally right in response to use of chemical weapons, legally doubtful, but perhaps stretching things possible to justify, but politically not necessarily effective. The real question is, what are the dangers of acting, and are they bigger than the dangers of not acting? This is a very fine judgment that President Obama has to make, because again the United States finds itself as the indispensable country. And I don't envy him to having to make that decision, and I think he did the right thing referring the thing to Congress, because when you're not sure of your legal position, what at least you want to have is a strong political mandate and a stronger support in the international community and in the court of global public opinion. He has also bought himself time for everybody to make the judgments, to evaluate the evidence, and to perhaps shift positions. Because I agree with that we do have a crisis of international governance. And the Security Council is simply not doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is not to be a place where selfish nation states look after their interests. It was supposed to be the voice of all humanity. And I can't think of a better case where the voice of all humanity should be heard than to protest against the use of these heinous weapons. And another argument for reforming the Security Council.
Mr. President.
Well, global governance versus sovereignty. I mean, I'll start from afar, but I mean, one reason why the requirement for democracy in NATO is that if you want to go to a war, you need to make sure, I mean, to defend someone, you want to know you're going to defend people who share your values, because your own people won't support it. The problem, while, I mean, some of these comments, limited nature of interventionism today, which I would also say is true in the United States. If you look at sort of the battles with will Congress support Barack Obama or not, is that we are democratically elected governments. It's not clear what our publics will support. We are not part of the sovereignty crew that is non-democratic or believe in sovereign democracy. There are limits as to how far we can go with publics today, especially in countries that have been significantly involved previously in both Iraq and Afghanistan, which limits the options. As much as we would like to do one thing or another, if your people don't support you, it's not going to go anywhere. And so, I mean, and we do see an increasingly isolationist mood among publics. We may be here foreign policy wonks turned politicians, but if people at home don't want to do that, be it in the United States or be it in tiny Estonia, you're not going to do that. Or, I mean, we've already expended lots of political capital in a lot of these countries by, on Iraq, on Afghanistan, on some of the Balkan wars. And so this is a tendency that it's just as big in the U.S. as it is in Europe. And so maybe the best option we should be thinking about in the long-term future is a kind of containment policy, which might, unfortunately, in the case of Europe, turn into a wall. That is, we can't contain everything, but we'll build our own wall. But so, I mean, the general mood I detect right now for a longer time, and as a result of our experiences, people are loath to go into interventions, or publics are. And rather the mood, if you look at some of the xenophobia in Western Europe these days, that there's an anti-immigrant attitude. And so maybe what we are going to see in the next 15, 20 years is rather, let's keep them out. We won't go there as long as they don't come here. And I think that's a real possibility, and we see that tendency rising with both, look at what the Netherlands wants to do with East Europeans. We see that what a number of countries want to do with the Arabs. That is something I think we should be worried about in the long term far more, rather than are we going to go in or not, because I don't see sort of generally countries going in. You can throw a few missiles, fly some drones, but the more broad, sort of the liberal interventionist agenda of the post-Solidarność period, which is where there was extreme action, is no longer on the table, no longer on the agenda. And one of the best examples is, I think, which is, again, I come back to the Eastern Partnership, is that who's really pushing for it? A small number of countries, Sweden, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We're big on it. The rest of the people are kind of nonplussed. And I suspect one of the reasons for a lack of response to the rhetoric coming from Russia toward these countries is that there are a number of countries who feel a sigh, or uttering silent sighs of relief, that thank God the Russians did it for us.
I don't know if we're quite to the end. I want to offer a thought. After all this, I want to, at least this will be my last thought. I'm sure it won't be everyone else's. Europe can and has achieved, and the EU specifically, a lot. So the point of my framework wasn't to argue that Europe has to go to its safety school. It's actually that you just have to set the right objective and then work at it. In the period in which I previously served in the Obama administration's Defense Department, I was responsible for Southeast Europe as well as Russia and Eurasia. And the EU helped Croatia reconcile a lot of issues with its neighbors. That was EU. That was the attraction of membership, but it was also a lot of focused diplomacy and support. And then Kosovo and Serbia. We have an agreement about northern Kosovo, between Kosovo and Serbia. And the only reason we have that, which is probably preventing a conflict in Europe somewhere down the road, is because the EU chose that as an objective and devoted the resources to it and brought all the best and the strongest resources that the EU is good at to that specific strategic objective, and at the highest levels, too. So I don't think the takeaway from this should be the world is a disaster and we can't do anything and Europe's a mess, and that was not my message. My message is actually Europe can do a lot, but you have to be clear about the objectives and you have to devote the resources to it together, and hopefully in partnership with the United States, or you can lead us for a change. That's fine with me.
So, Minister Bildt, can you beat the American optimism?
Well, I'm not quite certain I could do that, because Europeans, by definition, tends to be take a somewhat more cynical view of history. I think the great thing with America is the optimism, but sometimes it needs to be tempered by a somewhat cynical view of history, and I think the combination is really the strength of the transatlantic relationship. What Celeste said, it reminds me of the Piran Bay. Who's heard of the Piran Bay? One, I suspected two. Yeah. I'm very happy with that. I spent an enormous amount of time trying to sort out that particular problem. And the fact that there are all of these problems that are now forgotten is a very good testimony to actually European integration working sometimes. There are quite a number of those. There was a question of the international community lessons. I mean, the international community, or the global system of governance, is, as we know, it's a 1945 system designed to deal with conflicts between states. And the issues that we've been facing increasingly is, of course, strife within states. And then it gets complicated, and will remain complicated for quite some time. We have, from the EU side, I agree with that slightly critical remarks, we have designated X numbers of strategic partners. I don't know how many there are, 10 or 15 or something like that. In reality, I always point out we have two strategic partners. We have one that's United States, and I think the discussions that we've had in different fora during the last week have been profoundly important and deep. And then it's Turkey, which is in a very exposed position. Those are the partners. The rest are relationships with all of the ups and downs associated with them. Then back to Syria, because it is obviously, and should be, an issue that is on our minds and our conscience, and it illustrates a lot of the dilemmas that we do have. The immediate issue now is reaction against the use of chemical weapons. There has to be reaction, no question. We would all prefer that to be the UN Security Council. If it's not, let's see what we do. But there has to be a reaction, no question about that. All European governments agree on that. But then there is the day after. And remember, I don't remember how many periods of air campaigns and bombings there was against Iraq and Saddam Hussein. 3, 4, 5, 6. And the day after looked virtually the same. And I fear that, I'm not saying this against reacting at chemical weapons, but the overall thing is likely to look roughly the same, possibly worse, the day after. What mistakes have been done in the Syrian conflict? Well, let the historians after some time deal with that, but clearly we misread it. We thought it was a fairly simple thing. We called for Assad to step down, and we beefed that up with a couple of sanctions and statements, and thought that was it. And we are faced with civil war spreading over the Levant. Had there been any way of dealing with it better? Well, I prefer to leave it to the historians, but it's not an easy thing. I think what we agree, all the Europeans and the Americans, President Obama, Secretary Kerry, is at the end of the day, there's no escaping a political solution. That's easy said, somewhat more difficult to do. And for that political solution to work, you need to deal with everyone. I mean, I don't know how many members there are here of the European-Russian Friendship Society, but that, irrespective of that, you have to deal with them. We have to bring the Iranians into that. I don't know any peace agreement where we haven't dealt with those that make the war in order to make that peace agreement actually work. Go back to Lebanon war, to take that one. Went on for 15 years, X numbers of interventions. I'm quite certain that both Americans and Europeans made X numbers of statements. At the end of the day, the Taif agreement, which is a very complicated agreement, and calling in the Syrian army of everyone to bring stability to Lebanon. Did it work? I don't know. But those are the profoundly difficult issues of political agreement at the other day, the day after, that we must increasingly confront. There are no easy answers. There are only massive challenges, and we can only deal with them together in a slightly longer time perspective than the evening news.
The sad thing about those conferences is that they end. It's also a good thing because finally we can have the glass of wine that we are longing for. I thank you very much. I have the big advantage of not having to wrap up anything. Somebody else will do this. Minister Edgar Rinkewicz will now do the final difficult job. But I think before you start speaking, the panel should get its applause. Huh? Okay.